Imagine a salesman so persuasive he convinces you that the product he's offering doesn't even exist, yet you must dedicate your life, your money, and your conscience to it. That salesman is religion, and the product? Eternal happiness after death. It's a marketing pitch that's run uninterrupted for thousands of years, with no refunds, no proof of delivery, and an audience so loyal they're willing to kill for the privilege of being lied to. Religion sells what no other business dares. Invisible goods with infinite warranties. Salvation, forgiveness, paradise, divine favor. Abstract luxuries payable through obedience and guilt. The entire structure runs not on faith, as it claims, but on fear. The fear of meaninglessness. The fear of punishment. The fear that without some cosmic parent watching over us, we might have to grow up and take responsibility for our own morality. It began innocently enough, perhaps. The early human looked at thunder and thought, someone must be angry. A primitive attempt to explain the terrifying randomness of nature. But over time, those explanations hardened into hierarchies. Priests replaced thinkers, rituals replaced curiosity, and fear became the currency of control. If you were born under the wrong sky, the wrong story was already waiting for you. A God of mercy who demanded blood, a God of love who threatened eternal fire, a God of justice who endorsed slavery, genocide, and silence. The contradictions didn't matter, because the alternative doubt was forbidden. Doubt, after all, doesn't pay tithes. And so, temples grew into empires. The Vatican became richer than kingdoms. Preachers turned poverty into profit. The divine message was simple. Obey, donate, and die believing. Questioning it became not only heresy, but insanity, because faith systems learned long ago that the easiest mind to govern is the one that feels guilty for thinking. Look at how religion frames the human condition. You are born broken, and only it can fix you. It invents the disease, then sells the cure. You are a sinner, it whispers, and your only hope lies in surrender. A perfect business model. It guarantees a lifetime customer base. All you need is to convince them they're unworthy of happiness without your approval. Even the language of religion is psychological warfare. Words like blessed and forgiven imply ownership of goodness itself. If something good happens, it's because God smiled upon you. If something bad happens, well, that's part of his mysterious plan. Heads they win, tails you lose. It's a monopoly on meaning, wrapped in poetry and fear. The brilliance of religion's scam isn't just in its theology, it's in its adaptability. Every era, it reinvents itself just enough to stay relevant. Once it justified monarchies, now it blesses democracies. Once it condemned science, now it pretends to embrace it, so long as it doesn't threaten its market share of certainty. It adjusts the slogans, not the strategy. The prophets may change, the holy books may differ, but the underlying message remains identical. Submit. Every religion sells the same illusion that there exists an all-seeing authority whose validation you must earn. A celestial surveillance state with eternal jurisdiction, disguised as love. Even dictators retire. Gods do not. And yet, the irony is that religion began as a desperate attempt to make sense of the unknown, a poetic instinct to connect with something larger than ourselves. But poetry became policy. Mystery turned into dogma. And now, humanity is left worshiping its own metaphors, kneeling before ideas it once created to comfort itself. Consider how skillfully religion hijacks morality. People often claim you need belief to be good. But look closer. Goodness existed long before gods were invented. Compassion, empathy, fairness. These are not divine patents. They are biological, social, deeply human. Yet religion took credit for them, like a thief writing his name on someone else's masterpiece. If morality truly came from holy books, then no one could ever disagree on right and wrong. Yet every scripture contradicts itself. Every faith interprets the same commandment differently, and every preacher seems to have an exception when it benefits him. Thou shalt not kill, unless God says so, of course. Then it's a holy act. And what a convenient setup. You can commit any atrocity, as long as you do it with divine approval. History reads like a catalog of crimes endorsed by heaven. Crusades, witch hunts, jihads, inquisitions, all blessed bloodshed, done with the serene conviction that the Almighty was keeping score in your favor. The slaughtered may have doubted, but the faithful never did. The most efficient scams don't just steal your money, they steal your confidence in ever being free from them. Religion does exactly that. It doesn't merely ask for belief, it demands identity. You aren't just someone who believes. You are the belief. The self merges with the system until criticism feels like personal attack. That's why logical arguments rarely work. You can't debate someone out of what they think they are. Behind every ritual, there's a subtle psychology of dependency. Prayer, for instance, offers the illusion of agency. You speak, you hope, you wait. Sometimes it works, and you call it proof. When it doesn't, you call it a test. Either way, the cycle continues. The addict never blames the drug. He blames his dosage. And notice how religion always moves the goalposts of evidence. You can't see God because he's beyond perception. You can't test him because he transcends logic. You can't question him because doubt is sin. It's the perfect defense mechanism. Unfalsifiable claims, guarded by emotional blackmail. But perhaps the greatest genius of the religious scam lies in how it disguises control as comfort. People don't cling to religion because it makes sense. They cling to it because it makes fear bearable. It tells them death isn't the end, suffering has a reason, and cosmic justice will eventually fix what life couldn't. Even if it's false, it feels better than the silence of uncertainty. And so, faith becomes anesthesia, a psychological painkiller with severe side effects. Meanwhile, those who profit from it understand this perfectly. They don't need to prove God exists. They only need you to believe that you'd be lost without him. And once that belief takes root, they can dictate nearly anything. How you dress, who you love, what you eat, when you kneel, even how you think about your own body. Control disguised as devotion. The first priest didn't have divine inspiration, he had social intelligence. He realized that if you can convince people their suffering is sacred, they'll endure it willingly. Tell the poor that humility is holy, and they'll thank you for their chains. Tell the rich that their wealth is God's blessing, and they'll call their greed generosity. In both cases, the lie keeps the hierarchy intact. Religion thrives not on truth, but on repetition. Recite the same stories enough times, and they start to feel eternal. Myths fossilize into morals, and the collective memory forgets they were ever inventions. The earliest storytellers would be stunned to see how their metaphors hardened into laws, how symbolic serpents and talking donkeys became divine revelation. It's a strange thought. If religion appeared today as a startup, promising immortality in exchange for lifelong obedience and donations, it would be laughed out of existence. But because it's ancient, we call it sacred. Longevity, it seems, is mistaken for legitimacy. And yet, that's the beauty of the con. It doesn't need to be true, only traditional. People fear betraying their ancestors more than they fear betraying their reason. The weight of inherited belief is heavier than logic, because it's soaked in love, nostalgia, and identity. To question, it feels like treason against your grandmother's prayers. That's how deep the scam runs. It hides in affection, in family dinners, in lullabies. By the time you can think for yourself, the idea of thinking differently already feels immoral. The cleverness of religion isn't in the stories themselves, it's in how they've been weaponized. Every myth begins as metaphor. A story about good and evil becomes a code of conduct. A parable about humility becomes a system of hierarchy. The problem isn't that people once believed. It's that belief was industrialized. Once the sacred became institutional, it stopped being spiritual. The temple turned into a bank, the priest into a broker, and prayer into a transaction. Give, and you shall receive, the divine version of a customer loyalty program. The difference is that here, the reward is eternally deferred. It's always after you die. No other contract in human history could get away with delivering the product only posthumously. And what a brilliant arrangement. If the promises were testable, they'd collapse overnight. That's why religion thrives on ambiguity. Heaven and hell exist precisely because they can't be verified. The scam only works if the receipt is printed in the afterlife. The moment the product becomes tangible, the illusion evaporates. This explains why every era's religious leaders have resisted progress. Not because progress contradicts faith, but because progress reduces dependence. When science explains disease, prayer loses its monopoly on healing. When philosophy explains morality, Scripture loses its claim to authority. The more humanity learns, the smaller the gods become. And so, to preserve their influence, religions adapt through fear. They change costume, not character. Yesterday, it was, God will smite you. Today, it's, you'll lose your spiritual center. The vocabulary softens, but the mechanism stays the same. Convince people that disobedience equals emptiness, that without belief, life is meaningless. But life without religion is not meaningless, it's unfiltered. It's seeing the universe without subtitles, without someone whispering what it really means. It's not comforting, no, but it's honest. And honesty, though painful, is more sacred than any verse carved in stone. Religion calls itself a source of moral order. Yet what kind of order depends on divine threats to enforce it. A child who behaves only out of fear of punishment is not moral, he's trained. Replace child with believer, and the analogy holds. If the only reason to be good is to avoid eternal torment, then goodness has nothing to do with conscience and everything to do with compliance. Consider the absurdity of the divine justice system. Eternal reward for temporary belief. Eternal punishment for temporary doubt. A cosmic totalitarianism that punishes curiosity but rewards submission. And still, we call that love. If any human ruler behaved this way, we'd call him a tyrant. Yet when a deity does it, it's called holiness. Religion's moral code has always been more about obedience than virtue. The highest commandment isn't kindness, it's loyalty. Not compassion, but conformity. You can be cruel in the name of faith and still be considered righteous, so long as your cruelty is doctrinally approved. But question the doctrine, and suddenly your kindness means nothing. That's not morality, it's brand allegiance. Even the way religion defines humility is strategic. It doesn't mean modesty. It means submission. To be humble is to know your place in the divine hierarchy. To be proud is to trust your own reasoning. In this way, independent thought becomes sin, and intellectual courage becomes arrogance. The mind's emancipation is recast as rebellion against heaven. It's fascinating how religion manipulates language to make surrender sound noble. Faith sounds virtuous. Doubt sounds weak. But in truth, doubt is the oxygen of understanding. Faith without doubt is not strength, it's paralysis. Yet, religion has convinced billions that curiosity is corrosive, that questioning is disrespect, that reason is rebellion, all to protect an idea too fragile to face scrutiny. And what's the most fragile idea of all? That we are being watched by an invisible intelligence who demands constant affirmation of his greatness. A being so omnipotent that he created galaxies, but so insecure that he needs continuous praise from one small species on one small planet. If that isn't divine narcissism, what is? When you think about it, religion operates like a cult that grew too successful to be recognized as one. The difference between a cult and a religion is just the number of believers and the amount of time that's passed. The same tactics: group identity, isolation from dissent, emotional dependency, just dressed in tradition's clothing. A cult with cathedrals is still a cult. Look closely and you'll see the same patterns everywhere. The repetition of chants to override critical thought. The uniform dress to erase individuality. The rituals of guilt and cleansing. The strict hierarchy where authority flows downward and guilt flows upward. It's psychological engineering at a civilizational scale. Even confession, one of the most intimate religious practices, is a masterpiece of control. You unburden your soul not to yourself or the person you've wronged, but to the institution that claims to represent God. You give it your secrets, your shame, your inner life, and in return, It gives you conditional forgiveness. You leave feeling purified, but the church leaves with information and power. The original data mining operation. And if the carrot of heaven isn't enough, there's always the stick of hell. Hell the most efficient invention in moral psychology. It ensures compliance, even in absence of oversight. You don't need guards when the prisoner polices his own mind. You don't need chains when guilt and fear do the work. The genius of hell is that it doesn't even need to exist to be effective. Belief alone is enough to enslave. But the fear of eternal punishment does something even more damaging. It erodes our capacity for joy. How can one fully love life when it's constantly compared to an imagined paradise? How can one truly feel free when every thought is judged by invisible standards? Religion trains people to see beauty as a test and pleasure as a trap. The world becomes a waiting room for heaven rather than a home worth living in. It's a subtle theft, the theft of the present. The promise of eternity steals the value of now. People spend lifetimes preparing for a sequel that has no proof of production. They endure suffering, suppress desire, and call it virtue, all for an asseveration afterlife written by men who feared death more than they loved life. And that fear, that's the real engine of the scam. The fear of nothingness. The fear that consciousness ends. Religion doesn't offer truth, it offers anesthesia. It replaces the abyss with a story, the silence with a song, and the unknown with a promise. A beautiful, soothing lie. Repeated until it feels like truth. But here's the paradox. To overcome the fear of death, one must first accept it, not worship it, not deny it, just accept it. That's what religion could have been, a philosophy of acceptance. Instead, it became a business of denial. Its greatest sin isn't that it deceived humanity, it's that it robbed us of the courage to face reality unfiltered. Imagine what it would mean if we could see existence without the lens of divine approval. To look at the stars and not think of judgment, but of wonder. To see suffering not as punishment, but as part of the fragile miracle of being. To recognize morality not as a list of divine rules, but as empathy evolved from shared vulnerability. That kind of honesty is terrifying and liberating. Because when you strip away religion's illusions, what's left isn't emptiness, it's possibility. The universe stops being a courtroom and becomes a conversation. Existence stops being a test and becomes an experience. And maybe, just maybe, that's what the prophets were trying to say before their words were turned into weapons. Once you start examining the mechanics of religion without reverence, the absurdity becomes impossible to ignore. Take prayer, for instance. Millions of people kneel daily, whispering their hopes and fears to a being who is allegedly omniscient and omnipotent. Yet somehow, outcomes are inconsistent. Some prayers are answered, some are ignored, and some people pray incessantly without ever noticing an effect. The mind is trained to interpret randomness as intervention, creating a sense of cause and effect where none exists. In other words, the believer is perpetually trapped in an elaborate cognitive illusion, a self-reinforcing feedback loop. And consider miracles, the supposed fingerprints of divinity. A child survives a rare disease. A storm dissipates just in time. A coin lands heads 7 times in a row. Are these miracles, or just the natural consequences of probability? Religion doesn't need to clarify, it only needs to claim. And once claimed, the miracle becomes proof, however fragile, that the system works. It's a textbook example of confirmation bias, dressed in ceremonial robes. Even morality is a playground for subtle deception. Do good because it is commanded replaces do good because it matters. Virtue becomes externalized, measured by adherence rather than understanding. And anyone who dares to act ethically outside the religious rubric is either a lucky exception or an unacknowledged anomaly. This creates a false monopoly over virtue, where obedience masquerades as morality and fear masquerades as piety. History provides endless examples. Entire populations have been mobilized under religious banners to commit acts that would otherwise be unconscionable. The logic is chillingly simple. If God commands it, then morality is irrelevant. The divine endorsement cancels conscience. Belief becomes an amplifier of cruelty, a justification machine that sanctifies acts that would otherwise be universally condemned. And the consequences are not only societal, they are psychological. Religion cultivates dependency. It teaches that humans cannot navigate existence without instruction from an invisible authority. Independent thought is framed as arrogance. Self-determination is painted as rebellion. Over time, individuals internalize this hierarchy, policing themselves with guilt, shame, and anxiety. A culture of self-censorship emerges, where curiosity is stifled and skepticism is punished. The mind becomes its own jailer. Rituals reinforce this dependency. Fasting, confession, pilgrimage. Every act serves a dual purpose: to express devotion and to create habituation. The believer repeats, the mind absorbs, and slowly the illusion crystallizes into identity. You are no longer just a person with beliefs, you are those beliefs. And once belief and identity merge, logic becomes subversive. Questioning your faith feels like questioning yourself. Religion also wields time as a weapon. It promises eternal reward or punishment, which stretches beyond human comprehension. The present is rendered insignificant compared to the infinite horizon of the afterlife. Every suffering is reframed as temporary. Every sacrifice justified as preparation. Death becomes the ultimate deferral, and life itself is treated as a rehearsal for an unverified sequel. It's the most sophisticated procrastination scheme ever devised, humanity willingly postponing life for a fantasy. And yet, the scam is not purely malicious. Its inventors understood human psychology better than we often give them credit for. They knew we crave order, meaning, and hope. Religion exploits this craving with surgical precision, offering comfort wrapped in obligation. People don't follow because the metaphysics are persuasive. They follow because the structure gives a sense of safety. The comforting lie becomes more attractive than the inconvenient truth. But herein lies the irony. The very system designed to alleviate fear often amplifies it. The same stories that promise salvation also threaten annihilation. The same rituals, meant to reassure, also enforce guilt. Faith is marketed as liberation, yet it requires surrender. Freedom is framed as obedience, and the deeper one immerses, the harder it becomes to see the mechanics of the deception. The con is not in what is said, it is in what is felt. And then there's the matter of exclusivity. Every religion claims a monopoly on truth, yet their truths are mutually incompatible. One faith promises eternal paradise for belief in a single deity. Another promises enlightenment through detachment. Another through works, ritual, or allegiance. The fact that billions of people claim divergent paths to salvation exposes the entire enterprise as a human construct. Truth becomes relative, shaped to reinforce submission rather than reason. The manipulation extends into society itself. Religion molds communities into obedient networks, aligned around shared fear and collective hope. It prescribes norms, mediates disputes, and polices behavior. In other words, it provides governance under the guise of divinity. Obedience to God doubles as obedience to the institution, and social cohesion is achieved not through shared understanding, but through shared submission. The sacred becomes the social contract, and yet this control is rarely acknowledged, even by practitioners themselves. People call it sacred duty, divine will, or spiritual necessity. The deeper, the internalization. The less conscious, the surrender. Humanity performs its own enslavement under the guise of devotion. And that, perhaps, is the ultimate genius of the scam. We are complicit, often unwillingly, in our own indoctrination. Religion's longevity is not due to truth, it's due to psychology. Fear, hope, repetition, and authority form a network too resilient for logic to dismantle. It persists because it exploits the deepest vulnerabilities of human consciousness: our desire for meaning, our fear of death, our need to belong. Remove evidence, remove proof, and still it thrives. It doesn't survive on facts, it survives on felt necessity. But necessity is a fragile thing. awareness, curiosity, and courage slowly erode it. The moment a mind stops fearing the unknown and starts embracing it, the scaffolding of belief begins to wobble. And when enough minds wobble together, civilizations change, not through argument, not through condemnation, but through the simple act of refusing to be fooled. Religion, at its core, is a story about fear, control, and hope. It is a human invention, dressed in poetry, administered through ritual, and justified with eternity. It has inspired art, literature, and architecture, but it has also inspired oppression, violence, and obedience. And perhaps that duality is what makes it so resilient. It offers both beauty and terror, and we are irresistibly drawn to both. What fascinates me most is how religion manages to make the impossible feel inevitable. It takes random events and imposes narrative structure. A storm becomes a punishment, a drought, a lesson, a fortunate harvest, a blessing. Chaos is reframed as divine plot. Humanity's primitive need for patterns is weaponized, and the mind, desperate for coherence, obliges. It's an illusion of causality, but one powerful enough to govern empires, dictate laws, and shape the trajectory of civilizations. Consider the origin stories of the world. They are rarely consistent, often contradictory, and yet treated as literal truth. One faith has creation in 6 days, another through cosmic balance, another through void and breath. Dozens of versions, all claiming divine authority, all competing for adherence. The underlying lesson is simple. Truth is secondary to obedience. The more you insist that your version is absolute, the more control you accumulate. And let's not overlook the economic engine religion became. Temples, churches, mosques, and monasteries were not merely spiritual centers. They were financial hubs. Tithes, donations, indulgences, and offerings. Every believer contributing to a system that thrives on the illusion of moral obligation. Wealth is legitimized as divine favor, poverty as a test of faith. Merit becomes measured not in effort or virtue, but in devotion, and devotion is purchased. Religion didn't invent commerce, but it perfected a moralized version of it. Then there's the selective morality, the cherry-picking of commandments to suit those in power. Laws that once punished thought and sexuality, that mandated obedience, now fade or are reinterpreted, but always in ways that preserve authority. If control cannot be maintained by fear alone, it is maintained through narrative. The God of yesterday becomes the symbol of culture today, and still, obedience is celebrated as wisdom. Yet the most insidious aspect is internalized control. Religion doesn't merely demand obedience, it teaches the mind to police itself. Guilt, shame, anxiety. These are distributed through doctrine and ritual, but they are absorbed individually. No external enforcer is needed. The believer becomes his own warden. Imagine a system so elegant that it makes prisons obsolete because the prisoner thanks you for putting him there. That is religious genius at scale. Prayer, confession, meditation, penance, each designed to reinforce this internal hierarchy. You speak, you reflect, you atone, you submit. And all the while, the institution watches, evaluates, and benefits, not necessarily in wealth alone, but in loyalty, compliance, and perpetuation. Psychological capital, harvested over lifetimes. If religion is a scam, it is the most durable ever devised. Invisible, voluntary, and self-sustaining. It thrives on promises it can never be held accountable for. An afterlife, forgiveness, divine love. It asks for absolute trust in exchange for intangible goods. The trick is that the believer cannot test the promise without violating faith itself. To doubt is both sinful and practically futile, because the only proof exists in a reality that is allegedly beyond experience. It is the ultimate self-protecting con. And this is why religion is a narrative about humans more than about gods. The divine is a canvas on which human fears, desires, and ambitions are projected. Heaven and hell reflect our moral hopes and anxieties. Miracles reflect our need for certainty in a chaotic world. Rituals reflect our need for structure and belonging. Gods may be imagined, but the consequences are very real on individuals, communities, and entire civilizations. The psychological dependency it fosters is profound. People pray for outcomes they cannot influence, plead for mercy they do not command, and defer responsibility for their own lives. It's the ultimate outsourcing of agency. And when control slips, religion has a ready defense. This is God's plan. The phrase absolves doubt, critique, and accountability. The system is unassailable because questioning it is framed as impiety, rebellion, or moral failure. Even the concept of sin is a masterstroke. It converts natural human impulses into moral liabilities. Desire becomes weakness. Curiosity becomes transgression. Individuality becomes hubris. And yet, it's always reversible through confession, penance, prayer. But notice the pattern. The believer is trapped in a cycle of self-inflicted guilt, constantly seeking redemption that never truly arrives. It is a treadmill disguised as moral education. History illustrates the consequences vividly. Religious wars, inquisitions, persecution of dissenters, condemnation of scientists, all manifestations of a system that prioritizes authority over truth, obedience over understanding. The pattern repeats across cultures and millennia. Claim divine mandate, mobilize believers, enforce compliance, maintain hierarchy. And the more absolute the claim, the more complete the control. Yet the scam has a softer face, too. Religion also offers beauty, art, music, architecture, literature. It inspires community, ritual, and shared purpose. These are real human achievements, products of creativity channeled through the framework of belief. But they also serve as emotional glue, binding the faithful to a narrative that is ultimately constructed, maintained, and sold by humans. Even love is reframed. Divine love is conditional. Obey, believe, and endure. Human love is often mediated through religious expectations. Charity, compassion, and altruism are praised, but only when they align with doctrine. The institution claims credit for natural human empathy, while simultaneously restricting the expression of that empathy outside its boundaries. And perhaps the most profound irony is this: religion began as a means to make the world comprehensible, but it gradually made the world controllable instead. It replaced curiosity with dogma, exploration with obedience, and wonder with fear. The original poets and philosophers who sought to connect humanity with the unknown would scarcely recognize the bureaucracies their visions became. Religion's persistence is a testament not to divinity, but to human psychology. It preys on fear, habit, and longing. It commodifies hope. It converts obedience into virtue, guilt into loyalty, and stories into power. It survives because it exploits the deep vulnerabilities of the human mind. Our need for meaning, our fear of death, our longing for connection. Even without evidence, it endures, because the human heart cannot resist reassurance, however illusory. And yet, every age has produced thinkers, skeptics, and iconoclasts who point out the mechanisms beneath the magic. They ask questions that unsettle the faithful. Why is obedience praised more than understanding? Why are the most violent acts often sanctified? Why does the promise of heaven require surrender rather than insight? These questions threaten the foundation of faith because they illuminate the system as what it is: human-made, psychologically engineered, and endlessly adaptable. When you strip away the ceremony, the metaphor, and the grand architecture, what remains is a remarkable feat of human ingenuity. A belief system that convinces billions to live by rules no one can objectively verify, and to enforce those rules on themselves and others. Its endurance is not divine, it is calculated. Not miraculous, it is psychological. It survives because it is woven into every fiber of our consciousness, disguised as morality, tradition, and identity. Consider the sheer efficiency of its illusions. Religion teaches that we are inherently flawed, that we must surrender to something greater, and that our ultimate reward is elsewhere. Every ritual, every prayer, every act of devotion reinforces this hierarchy. The mind is trained to seek guidance externally, to defer judgment, to accept authority. It's a system that transforms fear into compliance, hope into investment, and imagination into obligation. And yet, even in this manipulation, there is a kind of tragic beauty. Humans have longed for meaning, and religion has provided it, albeit at a cost. It elevates ordinary life to cosmic significance, gives context to suffering, and promises continuity beyond death. It is seductive because it resonates with a deep, universal desire to matter. But seduction does not equal truth, and every promise that requires blind obedience carries the shadow of coercion. The contradictions within religion are particularly revealing. Gods who are all-loving, yet demand sacrifice. Moral codes that condemn natural behavior. Rewards promised for devotion. Punishments for curiosity. These contradictions are tolerated, rationalized, or ignored because the system thrives not on coherence, but on compliance. Logic is secondary. Fear and hope are primary. The more one internalizes these contradictions, the less one notices them, until belief becomes synonymous with identity. History shows the cost of unquestioned belief. Empires rise and fall on theological justification. Lives are sacrificed for doctrinal purity. Minds are trained to suppress doubt. And yet, the devout continue to live and die believing, perpetuating the system. The endurance of religion is a testament not to its truth, but to its psychological sophistication. It is the oldest and most successful human-made enterprise, built on the architecture of hope, fear, and habit. What is most fascinating is that, despite its profound influence, religion is not necessary for morality, creativity, or meaning. Empathy predates Scripture. Ethics emerge from social necessity. Beauty exists independent of worship. Understanding does not require submission. In fact, removing the fear of divine judgment often liberates the mind, enabling humans to explore, create, and act with genuine compassion unmediated by authority or dogma. Religion's greatest achievement is its ability to make people complicit in their own subjugation. It trains the faithful to uphold the very structures that restrict them, to cherish the doctrines that limit them, to fear the independence that could free them. And this complicity is often invisible to the believer. They see piety as virtue, sacrifice as devotion, obedience as righteousness. And yet, each of these is precisely what sustains the system that manipulates them. And still, the human mind remains capable of piercing the veil. Awareness of the mechanisms, the fear, the habit, the promises, the contradictions, reveals the truth. Religion is not a cosmic mandate, it is a human creation, perfected over millennia to exploit the deepest vulnerabilities of the mind. It is simultaneously inspiring and confining, beautiful and oppressive, a story of our own making that we have been trained to treat as eternal. The paradox is profound. Religion offers comfort at the cost of autonomy, guidance at the cost of curiosity, meaning at the cost of honesty. It answers questions we did not ask, prescribes solutions we did not need, and commands loyalty we are taught to accept as virtue. And yet, its persistence testifies to our desire for reassurance, even when that reassurance is illusory. Understanding this is not condemnation, it is liberation. To recognize religion as a human invention, designed to influence and manipulate, is to reclaim agency. It is to see the world unfiltered, to confront uncertainty without fear, to measure morality by reason and empathy rather than edict. It is to live fully in the present, unshackled from promises of rewards that may never arrive. And so, the conversation does not end with criticism, but with reflection. What have we been taught to fear? What have we been trained to accept without question? How much of our identity is truly ours, and how much is borrowed from stories written to control us? These questions are uncomfortable precisely because they pierce the illusions that have guided humanity for millennia. Yet confronting them is also exhilarating. It opens the possibility of genuine freedom, of constructing meaning without intermediaries, of embracing life with curiosity rather than fear. To live without the crutches of divine approval is to face uncertainty with courage, to navigate existence with agency, and to find beauty in the unmediated experience of being. That, perhaps, is the reward that has always been available, not in promised heavens, but here, in the messy, fleeting, astonishing reality of life itself. And now, after tracing the contours of this human-made empire of belief, one must ask, where are you listening from? What time is it there? And what's your take on all this? Share your thoughts, not as a declaration, but as part of an ongoing conversation, because the dialogue itself may be one of the most meaningful exercises in reason, reflection, and intellectual courage that any of us can participate in.